I will be speaking on the subject of Islam and science for about 7 weeks, and my lectures are based mostly on work which I have done and published on the subject of Islam and science in various publications, journals, and chapters. So bear with me. I get technical sometimes, but I hope not to lose you all in the course of giving my lectures. But you can always ask questions at the end of the lectures in case you're not clear what I said or even disagree with what I said. So there is a window for asking questions at the end of the lectures during the Q&A session. But I hope to give a set of lectures which is informative, and perhaps also enlightening on the question of Islam and science. And I hope that after 7 weeks, you would have acquired some knowledge of science and left the lectures with better understanding of Islam and science. If that doesn't happen, then I think I have not achieved my goal of imparting knowledge on Islam and science to the extent. I hope the sound is clear because I some messages the sound is not clear because I don't have a microphone. I don't have an earphone with microphone on. I'm just relying on computer audio. So if that doesn't good quality sound, then I'm sorry.
Maybe a bit clear to the laptop or to the computer. There's some echo.
It's an echo, because my earphone with the mic on, I've tried. It doesn't work that well.
That one now is okay. Now it's
better, yeah.
When you get closer to the.
Yeah. So maybe I need to speak closer to the laptop.
Yeah.
Okay. So can I begin my lecture now?
Yes, go ahead. You see the PowerPoint?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's the maximum size, or maybe you can enlarge it so that it covers the whole page.
Okay, sure.
I think there's a cup symbol icon at the bottom.
Okay.
Just click on that and you will get a bigger picture. Yes.
How about that?
Okay. So basically, it's a lecture on the subject of Islam and science, and I have divided today's lecture into several parts. Yeah. For example, part number one is motivating the discussion on Islam and science. Number two, giving a rationale of the topic. Why do we need to discuss the issue of Islam and science? Number three, what are the objectives of the discourse? What do I hope to achieve in the discourse or at the end of it? Number four, what are the tools of analysis that I will be using in analyzing the question of the issue of Islam and science, or rather the relation between Islam and science? And these tools are the disciplines of history of science and philosophy of science. Next, I will move on to talking about the history of science, understanding the issue or the question of Islam and science. Then I will move on to relationship between Islam, science, and the philosophy of science. And there I will make a distinction between science and the philosophy of science, and what the philosophy of science can tell us, or in what way it can throw light on the question of the relationship between Islam and science. And there I will also the views of several philosophers of science from the Western academic tradition and also from the Islamic world. And then I will look at the contributions made by philosophers of science in their capacity as what I would call the cultural bearers of science. That means they are the ones who formulate and propagate the image of science as it is understood by the educated public. Because the task of creating the image of science does not lie in themselves, but rather in the historians and philosophers of science. They are the ones who tell us what is the nature of scientific knowledge, and not the scientists themselves. Scientists are too busy doing their own research that they are not in a position to act as what I would say public relations officers for science. So our notion of what scientific knowledge is obtained from what the historians and philosophers of science say. For example, in the West, it is by philosophers like Prof and Thomas. Then I will discuss also after that the contestation of the image of science. That means how is science to be understood or conceived, and how this image of science is formulated not only by Western philosophers, uh, but also by Muslim intellectuals who have participated in the discourse on science and religion. And I will end by making some concluding remarks. So that's the basic structure and outline of my talk today. By the way, am I getting through, at least in terms of the audio?
It's okay. Yeah.
I hope, Sharan, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So maybe the problem lies with some of your Wi-Fi, could be, yeah. Because if it's from this end, then Sharan would not be able to listen to me clearly.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will go on. Okay, next slide, motivating discussion. Now, here I'm trying to get at the sort of thing that crosses my mind when someone utters the phrase Islam and science. What is it that comes to mind when we come across the phrase Islam and science, or when we hear someone talking about Islam and science, or when we come across a book with the title Islam and science? And here I'm guessing at some possible responses that might emerge. For example, someone might think that, well, when we talk about Islam and science, we are talking about two incompatible forms of knowledge. Since Islam is a form of religion and the knowledge it gives us is religious knowledge. And science is a different type of knowledge, the critical and not the dogmatic type of knowledge. Yeah. So they are fundamentally different in nature, and therefore suggest that they are incompatible or perhaps in conflict. Yeah? So that's probably one reaction or one response to the phrase Islam and science. Yeah? And then related to that, someone might think, well, sometimes you can get a sort of a conflict between the two because there are different beliefs presented by Islam and science and what they say about the world. Yeah? For example, question of origin of man. Yeah. In Islam, the Quran, it says that we come from Adam and Eve, Adam dan Hawa. The creation account of the origin of man, which we share with Christianity. Yeah. But from a scientific point of view, based on Darwin's theory of evolution, the explanation is a naturalistic explanation, where man originates, man understood as particular species, i.e. Homo sapiens, originated from an earlier form which is perhaps similar or closer to the primates. Yeah. And so there might be a sort of an evolutionary connection between humans and primates, which perhaps are earlier form of form of life, a form of existence prior to man. So there you find different beliefs about the origins of man. So again, question of incompatibility when it comes to belief. Certain beliefs, not all of it. And perhaps another image that might come to one's mind when we hear the phrase Islam and science is that Muslim countries which practice the religion of Islam are behind those advanced countries like America, Japan, or Germany in terms of science and technology. Yeah. So again, Islam is not seen as progressive in a sense because as manifested in countries which have the Islamic faith, where people are, majority of them are Muslims, they are not as advanced as those other countries in terms of science and technology. Yeah. So the kind of responses here that I present are mainly negative, I admit. Yeah. But there, of course, there could be positive responses as well. But I would say that on the whole, the responses tend to be on the negative side because of the current situation in the relationship between Islam and science and what holds between them. Yeah. So only a few perhaps who have no knowledge would say that, well, if you look at the history of science, Muslims have made important contributions to the development of science during the Middle Ages. And in that case, you have a sort of a positive evaluation of science. But that is only well-versed or learned in the history of science, for example. Well, okay. Now, let's look at the next slide, which deals with the rationale for looking at the subject of Islam and science. Yeah? What's the justification for dealing with this subject? Why not deal with some other subject? Yeah? Is there any significance to this? Yeah? Now, my reason for dwelling on the subject of Islam and science is mainly or partly because of the central importance of science in today's world. The modern world is defined largely by science and technology. In almost all spheres of life, we find the intrusion of science and technology, and we can hardly escape from the product of science and technology if we just care to look at what's around us. Yeah? I mean, to take simple and immediate and direct example, the way we are communicating tonight, or perhaps not fully communicating because of the audio problem for some of you. This online lecture is made possible by technology, cyber technology, the internet, Wi-Fi, and so on. So even to communicate knowledge on relationship between Islam and science, I am presupposing the existence of a scientific and technological infrastructure that makes this presentation and communication possible. So we cannot deny the central importance of science and technology in the modern world today and in contemporary world culture. Yeah. So, given the central importance of science in modern society, when we deal with Islam and science, we are also dealing with the question of Islam and modernity. So, I'm locating the discourse on Islam and science within the broader discourse of Islam and modernity. Yeah, and to me, that's a crucial issue because whether Islam can fit itself or whether the two can somehow be reconciled or coexist harmoniously will determine Islam's continued relevance in the contemporary. Some critics have pointed out that Islam is not really compatible with modernity, and therefore suggesting that in future, as human civilization progresses, Islam will become less and less relevant to modern life and to the future life, which is further advancement from our current modern state. Yeah, and therefore, please, I'm not using any extension speaker or anything because, oh, I mean you all, yeah. I'm not using any earphones or anything because I don't have the ones which work. So I'll just continue with audio. Okay, so modernity to me is an important issue, and whether Islam can accommodate itself to modernity will depend largely on the relationship between Islam and science, and Islam and science and technology. So that's an important rationale to me in discussing the question of Islam and science, yeah, because of its close connection with modernity. But to tackle the question of modernity per se and its relation to Islam is a bigger issue. Yeah. So by confining it to science, I'm at least narrowing down the scope and making the discussion more manageable. If I were to change the subject to Islam and modernity, then that would imply an enlargement of the scope. And that cannot be managed, I think, within a span of 7 lectures. Okay. Now, so firstly, I would like to see Islam's connection with science and modernity, with the hope that we are able to come up with some sort of model or formula where they can fit into one another, where they can coexist harmoniously, and thereby making Islam relevant to the modern world. But at the same time, I'm trying to go beyond a parochial concern involving only Muslims and Islam, where I am trying to extend that discourse to include world civilization as a whole. Yeah. So it's not only a case of trying to make Islam relevant to modernity, but also I think a case for suggesting Islam's possible contribution to world civilization, especially in a globalized, living in a globalized world. We cannot speak or think or even act in compartmentalized terms. We cannot really have a clear separation between the Islamic world and the non-Islamic world because of the influence of globalization. Although admittedly, COVID has somewhat affected the trajectory of globalization. But even the COVID pandemic, what it shows, what it illustrates, the close connection between people of the world, yeah, and how difficult it is to control movements between people across the world, and hence the seriousness of the COVID pandemic problem. Yeah. So, given this kind of globalized world, we exclusively of Islam and science without engaging the rest of the world as well, and the non-Islamic world, I mean. So here, I'm also looking at the question of Islam and science in relation to the rest of the world, in relation to world civilization. Okay, let's move on. And here I will address directly the question of the objectives, so that we get more focus on the issue. As I have outlined here, there are three objectives. I'm sorry to make it like a sort of a research project or research paper, but it's for the purpose of getting clearer on this issue. Number one, to provide a better understanding of the relationship between Islam and science, both historically, that is looking at how it actually happened, and normatively, that is how it should be, yeah, or what ought to be the case in the relationship between Islam and science. Yeah. And why I mentioned this better understanding is because of the lack of a clear and proper understanding of the relationship. As I've just said earlier, when someone utters the phrase Islam and science, the sort of imagery that comes, the sort of things that crosses one's mind, sometimes misconceptions about the relationship. Yeah? So, in other words, we don't have a clear of the relationship, and therefore the need and better understanding. Number two, hopefully to provide a model of science in the Islamic world by having a proper understanding or genuine understanding or a good understanding of the relationship, thereby hoping to provide a model of science in the Islamic world or in Muslim societies where science can be authentically accommodated, not simply accommodated by expedient means through expediency, but accommodated within Islamic culture, and so that the development of science occur within a positive Islamic framework. And the task of reviving science within an authentic Islamic framework is something which we Muslims should aim at. And number three, well, I will go back to number two later when I mention about a project which I was involved with in 2015, the task force for science and technology. Okay, number three, to offer a solution to the cultural crisis faced by the modern world, which is largely influenced by Western civilization, by offering an Islamic perspective on science and technology. This would also be Islam's contribution to a globalized contemporary world civilization. I know it might sound ambitious or tall order, but the fact that Western civilization is currently undergoing a crisis is something which we cannot deny or dismiss, yeah, because this is something which even the Western intellectuals themselves have been talking about. It can be manifested in various ways. For example, increasing secularization have led to the younger generation searching and seeking for new philosophies of life, because they find that modern civilization does not offer them answers to existential questions of life, the meaning and purpose of life, and so on. So this feeling of being lost in a world which is materially advanced but spiritually poor is a reality in contemporary Western culture. Yeah? And the kind of philosophies that have cropped up, yeah, for example, existentialism, phenomenology, and so on, they are, I would say, attempts to address the question of humanity, question of existential life, and so on, in lieu of religion. That means it's a sort of a functional equivalent of religion, because to me, it is almost an imperative. Yeah, the desire for something which is beyond the intellectual, beyond the cognitive, beyond the technological, beyond the material, for something which, for lack of a better word, I would say spiritual. That desire, to me, is a psychological imperative, yeah, which has been a role which has been fulfilled by religion before, but which is denied through the increased secularization of the Western world. Okay, now I move on to a project that I was involved in, the Task Force on Islam and Science, which was initiated by a group of scholars and thinkers from Turkey, Pakistan, and other parts of the Islamic world, and where the task force was headed by Professor Ekmaluddin Ihsanoglu from Turkey, who was Professor of History of Science, distinguished scholar, and also the former Secretary General of the OIC. Yeah. So they gathered together a team of scholars, and I was part of the team, whose task was to discuss issues concerning relationship between Islam and science, both from the point of view of the content of the theories and from the point of view of history, philosophy, epistemology, and so on. And here I will take excerpts. Yeah, I will quote some of the passages that have appeared in some of the writings on the task force, yeah, and their aims, objectives, and so on, what they attempt to do. Yeah. So here, I'll just read these passages. Yeah. By resolving the perceived conflict between Muslim faith and science, the Muslim world can embark upon a new scientific awakening proposed by a group of scholars. And they have met to discuss big questions at the intersection of Islam and science. And the scholars have put forth new ideas on navigating the religious and ethical questions posed by science, such as how Muslim scientists can produce scientific research and remain people of faith, and so on and so forth. Okay, and the next bullet point I will read. Muslims over the centuries have helped develop science and its underlying foundations, but today the scientific enterprise in the Islamic world has almost come to a standstill. On the one hand, this task force seeks to dispel the impression that Islam and science are necessarily in conflict with each other. On the other hand, it also identifies some critical factors that we Muslims must pay attention to if we want to successfully navigate in these exciting scientific times and utilize science for the benefit of Islamic countries and the world at large. So Prof is quite careful to also add and the world at large. Now, 2 points that I need to expand on or explain a bit on the previous slide. That is, number one, the idea that there is no real conflict between Islam and science. And that's what I'm trying to show, yeah, that Islam is not intrinsically incompatible with science and modernity. Yeah? But having said that, if you read the passage earlier, it says that on the other hand, which suggests that that's not the whole story here. So on the other hand, critical factors should be paid attention to, yeah? Meaning to say that the relationship is not completely smooth. Yeah, it's like a marriage, yeah, between a man and a woman. Yeah, the husband and wife do not necessarily get along well all the time in all areas of life. Yeah, there might be some problems here and there, glitches here and there, but they need to be ironed out, need to be faced with. Yeah, you need to take the bull by the horns, as it were. Yeah. So what Isanoglu is insinuating there is that the situation is not completely non-problematic. It's not completely free of any underlying problems. Yeah, there are problems, and one has to take a realistic and pragmatic approach towards the matter. And for a start, one should bring it out in the open. So one of the points about dealing with the question of Islam and science is to bring these issues out in the open. Because if you push it under the rug, on the carpet, then we are not going to solve problems. We are not going to trash out the issues that have become obstacles in the way of the progression of the Muslim Ummah through the utilization of science and technology. So it is important that we discuss those problems and also admit our own feelings, because it's quite unrealistic to simply glorify the past when we pretty well know how bad things are at present. And if we continue in this kind of nostalgic glorification of the past, then we are not in a position to improve ourselves in future. So it's better for us to be truthful about what the situation is, rather than provide this sort of honky-dory picture of Islam and science and say that everything is fine when things are not really so. It's only by admitting our weaknesses that we're able to overcome them. So that's the first condition of overcoming the weakness, which is to identify and admit them before you can actually correct them. Okay. Now, yeah. So, and another point about this discourse on Islam and science is, as suggested in the bullet point right at the bottom. Yeah, it is, in answering this question, the task force also seeks to reclaim the narrative of science within the Islamic community, the narrative that in the recent years has been imposed from outside rather than created from inside, and hence begin an inside-out process of scientific revival within the Islamic world. Yeah. So this idea of getting Muslim scholars together and trashing out issues on Islam is a way of reclaiming the narrative on science and religion, especially science and Islam, by Muslims themselves. Yeah, because, mind you, the question of Islam and science is not only discussed by Muslim scholars, but also by non-Muslim scholars, including Western scholars, who are perhaps but they nevertheless do not share the same sympathies that we share as Muslims. Yeah? When we criticize Islamic science, for example, we are not totally debunking it. We are perhaps pointing out some of its problems or weaknesses. But when a non-Muslim does that, he could have a different motive altogether. Yeah? He might simply not think Islam is relevant to the modern world anymore. Yeah? So the motivations in the discourse are different. Yeah? So it is up to Muslims themselves to reclaim the narrative, yeah, for the benefit of the Muslim Ummah. Yeah? And it is this idea of reclaiming the narrative of Islam and science that Muslims should sincerely engage in, yeah, so that the intellectual dialogue continues for the benefit of the Muslims. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? Now, how can we get a good grasp of the issues involved concerning Islam and science? What are the tools that we can use to analyze the problems and issues involved in the relationship between Islam and science. Yeah? And here, I'm proposing that we use the tools provided by the two disciplines, i.e., history of science and philosophy of science. Because, as I have pointed out, yeah, in order to understand the present, we have to understand the past. I think I've got this on my next slide. Yeah. And we can only understand the past if we understand history of science. Yeah. So history has provided us of how the relationship has actually occurred, how it took place, what really happened in the interaction between Islam and science in the past. Yeah. So at least that provides us with some sort of secure knowledge base in which to make conclusions or generalizations about Islam and science. Otherwise, our views, our pronouncements on Islam and science would not be based on any reliable foundation. Yeah, it would be just mere speculation. I think as scholars, we have the duty of reminding ourselves that what distinguishes a scholarly approach from a popular approach towards an issue is the reliance on reliable knowledge, yeah, on some sort of secure knowledge foundation. Yeah. And here, I can't think of a better resource than the history of science. Yeah. In order to help really understand what actually happened in the past, how science was accommodated, or how science was received within medieval Islamic culture, for example. Yeah. For example, nowadays we might be glorifying past Muslim scientists like Al-Khwarizmi or Sina or Haytham and so on. Yeah? But that is taking a perspective of the present and transposing it onto the past. Were these scientists also accorded similar prestige in their own society, or were they somehow marginalized? So these are issues which we can only properly understand, by studying the history of science. Yeah? So we cannot adopt populist coffee shop kind of approach if we were to really be serious about understanding the relationship between science and Islam. We have to look at the history of science in order to gain some genuine understanding of the relationship. And the genuine understanding of science can help to dispel certain misconceptions about the relationship between Islam and science. Yeah. And provide us with a more accurate picture of the relationship. And then from there we can make inferences as to whether Islam is able to accommodate the scientific culture, or whether science and Islam are compatible or incompatible and so on. Because at least we have some historical. Yeah. Okay, can we move on to the next slide? And also, I think history of science can provide Muslims with greater self-confidence in approaching science and technology. Because then they will be able to see that the Muslims have actually contributed to development of science. For example, between the 9th and the 14th centuries, there was tremendous development in the Muslim world, where Muslims, well, the Islamic world, were the leaders in science and technology. Yeah. And during that period, Europe was largely in what they themselves, the Western scholars themselves, term as the Dark Ages. Yeah. After the fall of Rome, the sacking of Rome by the barbarians, there was no new developments in knowledge. There was a stagnation in learning, and it was Islam that preserved and developed further Greek knowledge. Yeah? until it was later retransmitted back to Europe via Spain through the translation movement of the 12th century. Yeah? So Europe owes a depth of gratitude in terms of knowledge in science and philosophy and so on to the Muslims. Had the Muslims not developed the knowledge which they acquired from the Greeks through the period of the 9th to the 14th century, Europe might not have advanced to the stage it is now. Yeah? Because one of the pillars of revival of learning in the West was the establishment of medieval university. Yeah? And if you look at the establishment of earliest medieval universities in Europe, they were established around the period 12th to 13th centuries. Yeah? Universities like in Italy, Bologna, Salerno, and in France, University of Paris, in England, University of Oxford. They were, of course, related to religious authorities. Yeah? But the fact was that they could not have set up these universities without a body of knowledge to base their learning on. Yeah? And where does that knowledge come from? It is largely through the translated works which European scholars carried out based on the rediscovery of Greek knowledge through Muslim sources, through the libraries of Cordoba and Toledo in Spain. Because Spain, as we know, was under Muslim rule until 1492, from 711 to 1492. But earlier than 1492, there have been parts of Spain which were reconquered by the Christians. Yeah? And that enabled them to access the Muslim libraries in Cordoba and Toledo. And that was where they rediscovered the knowledge of the Greeks and the Muslims and translated them back into Latin. Yeah? And so that enabled the revival of learning in Europe. And this is something which we can find in history of science books written by Western scholars themselves. And it's not something which I, as a Muslim, propagate as a part of my parochial view on the matter. It's something which is acknowledged by Western historians. It is a historical fact. But the further claim I'm making here is that the universities in Europe would not have been established without the knowledge base. Yeah? Because the philosophies of Plato, Aristotle, the science of Euclid, the science of Ptolemy's astronomy, and so on, they were acquired through the translated works of the Muslims. Yeah? If you say that the Renaissance, which was associated with revival of learning, took place in the 16th century in Italy, then that would have been too late, because the universities in Europe, medieval universities, were established much earlier than the 16th century. Yeah? So it could not have been based on the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance of the 16th century, the establishment of the medieval universities. So to me, this is a crucial point which Muslims themselves need to understand. Europe's debt to Islam in terms of knowledge development. And only history can give us this kind of insight, and therefore provide us with the confidence which they are currently lacking because of the lack of knowledge of this. Okay, can we move on? Okay. Now, moving on from history, I now enter the territory of philosophy. Yeah? Because, as I've said, the two disciplinary tools which I'll be using in analyzing the relationship between Islam and science are, number one, history of science, and number two, the philosophy of science. And this would be another field of knowledge that would contribute tremendously towards understanding of the relationship between Islam and science, and perhaps resolve some of the important issues in the relationship between Islam and science, especially in terms of epistemology and philosophy. Okay. Before we can gain an understanding of how this could possibly be achieved, how philosophy of science can throw light on the relationship between Islam and science, I have first of all to make clear the distinction between science and the philosophy of science. Yeah? So can we move to the next slide? Okay. Now, if we regard science as occupying what I would call the object level, where science serves as the object of analysis, then the philosophy of science would occupy the level above it, which is the meta level. Yeah? So you can imagine philosophy as being at the upper level, meta level, reflecting on science, which is at the object level. Yeah. So they are not equivalent, they're not equal in terms of the status as far as the epistemological analysis is concerned. One serves as the object of analysis, which is science, and the other, which is philosophy, exists at the meta level and reflects on that object, which is science. Yeah? Thus, philosophical pronouncements on science is different from the object, on the subject or content of science itself. So in other words, what I'm saying is that science is science. It is one and the same. Yeah. But philosophical views of science can vary and can be different. You could have philosopher A saying that science is such and such, and philosopher B saying that science is not that way, it's some other such and such. So in other words, you could have different philosophical interpretations of science. And in the scholarly world, it's perfectly acceptable. Yeah. For example, we have in the West debates between followers of Karl Popper and followers of Thomas Kuhn on what the nature of scientific knowledge is. Yeah? And they don't say that, well, this indicates something wrong with the world of knowledge. No. It's part of the tradition in the humanities to differ on their views of certain things. Yeah? There is a pluralism rather than monism of ideas or viewpoints with regard to the humanities, and this is fairly normal in Western academic intellectual tradition. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So again, my point here is that science, which consists of the various natural sciences like physics, chemistry, and biology, is one and the same. You don't have a Russian physics or an American physics or Christian physics or Muslim physics. Physics is physics. It is made of the same set of theories: relativity theory, quantum theory, electromagnetism, and so on. This is what makes up physics. It's one and the same, but the philosophies of science, which looks at physics, which looks at science, they can vary and they can be different. And here I'm again giving the example of the two famous philosophers of science of the 20th century, because I was educated in that tradition. I had to read Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn over and over again, because those were the two influential philosophers in the Western world. Yeah? But they took radically different positions on the nature of science. Yeah? The science they refer to and reflect upon, such as physics, is one and the same. But the philosophy of science that they formulated are not one and the same. It's highly debatable, highly contested, yeah, by the two schools of thought. Yeah. Popper is more of a modernist philosopher who retains that earlier Enlightenment idea of science as being rational, objective, progressive, and true, whereas Kuhn tends towards a more postmodernist approach towards science, where those modernist assumptions are rejected. So the idea of science being completely rational is questioned by Kuhn, by his idea, through his idea of incommensurability of theories and paradigm shifts and so on, but where the paradigm shifts are not based on any logical or rational criteria. And the notion of science, scientific change as leading to some sort of ultimate truth is again challenged by Kuhn, where he said that there is no convergence toward a singular picture of the universe. What we have is alternation between one picture and another, and there is no convergence, so there is no sort of progression towards truth. So, although they are reflecting on the same science, but they could come up with different views on the nature of science. And this is me, and the interesting part about philosophy as opposed to science itself, because philosophy makes it possible to achieve some sort of cultural accommodation of science, yeah, to suit one's cultural values, yeah, without necessarily being terribly prejudicial or distorted in one's views about science. And I will move on to the next slide. Now, again, here, I want to impress upon you the role occupied by philosophers of science in society and culture. Yeah. Their role as what I would say the cultural bearers of science through their formulation and projection about the nature and image of science. Yeah. Because if you think about it, our idea of the nature of science is not obtained by reading the works of scientists, empirical or theoretical scientists. Real physicists or real chemists, they are too busy carrying out their research either in the lab or in their office if they are theoretical physicists. To them, it's a diversion from their core business. If they were to articulate their views on the nature of scientific knowledge, whether it is rational, empirical, or whether it has its own limitations and so on. Yeah? That is not the job of the natural scientists. Their job is to develop knowledge in their various specialties in science. Yeah. So it is left to the philosophers of science, or currently not only the philosophers but also the historians and the sociologists of science, to articulate that image of science and present it to the public, especially to what I would call the educated layman. Yeah. So that image of science is the doing of the philosophers of science, or the historians of science, or the sociologists of science, not of the scientists themselves. Yeah. So the kind of philosophies that are projected would then influence one's view and image of science. Okay, let's move on. And I've said Karl Popper and mentioned. Okay. Now, what the scenario tells us is that there is a contestation for the image of science in the academic world. Yeah. Philosopher A would say that science is objective and rational. Philosopher B would say that no, science is subjective, perhaps, or influenced by social factors. That, like what the social constructivists are claiming. They say that science, like other forms of knowledge, they are social constructions where human interests and values influence the production of scientific knowledge. So it's not completely objective in that sense. Yeah. And they have arguments to support that claim. So it's a contestation for the image of science to suit their own views about culture and modernity. Yeah. And Muslim scholars and thinkers have joined the fray which was engaged in by Western thinkers earlier. They were joined in later by Muslim intellectuals such as Syed Hussein Nas, Jauddin Sada, and our own Malaysian Syed Najib Alatas, yeah, who also offered their own views of science, but from an Islamic perspective. So they have joined the fray and entered this contestation in the arena of intellectual thought. And this kind of dialectical engagement by Muslim thinkers, I think, is a healthy development. Yeah, because it ensures that the West do not have a monopoly over the discourse on science or on the image of science or on science and religion. That Muslims do have their own intellectual capacity to articulate their own views about the nature of science and technology and so on from an Islamic perspective. And that this engagement is not one-sided. The views presented by Muslim scholars, as Syed Hussein Nas, is highly respected even by the West. Yeah. So that sort of role is, as I've said, played by the philosopher of science. And in this case, Syed Hussein Nas was considered a philosopher of science, although taking an Islamic position on the issue. So the value, as I've written here, the value of such philosophical reflections for Muslims is to enable them to reflect on science and its place on Islamic culture and system, and thus accommodating science within or into Islamic thought and culture. He does not reject science, but render it safe for Muslim consumption. Yeah. So, in this respect, the project called Islamization of Knowledge, as I see it, is also another attempt at making science kosher for Muslims, that it's safe for Muslim consumption. That the image of science is such that it is not something which is alien to Muslim concerns or Muslim perspective, yeah, Islamic perspective. So, okay. So, again, here, it's philosophy doing its job of reclaiming the narrative for Muslims on behalf of Muslims by Muslims. Okay, my concluding remarks. So from that survey of the issues involved in the relationship between Islam and science, and how history of science and philosophy of science fits in, we can get an idea of what the discourse actually involves and how it could be further advanced, and what sort of advantages and benefits we can derive from such a discourse. And hopefully we can clarify some of the issues involved and lead to a much better understanding of Islam and science, which would then further lead to a better acceptance of science within the Islamic world, and provide Muslims with greater confidence in carrying out the task of reviving the Muslim Ummah through the proper utilization of science and technology in a way which is not alien to our culture, to our Islamic culture, or alien to our belief. And doing so in a way which does not sacrifice or compromise the authenticity of the Islamic faith and religious practice. Okay, I think that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. A very substantial presentation. I think it's very enlightening even for us who have zero background of Islam and science. We have many questions in our chat box. I will choose one is relevant for today. We take first from Brother Abdullahi Ibrahim. Simple one. What can we say is the scientific theory in Islam or in the glorious Quran?
Can you repeat the question?
Okay. What can we say is the scientific theory in Islam? I mean, from Islamic perspective, what is scientific theory? Or in the Quran?
Well, to me, a scientific theory is a scientific theory. It's a theory which tells us about what the natural world is like. You know, if it's a biological, if it's a theory in biology, then it tells us about certain properties of biological organisms or the biological world. If it's a theory in physics, then it tells us about the nature of the physical world. So, to me, science is science, and there is uh, little that one can project onto it in terms of religious beliefs, without actually interfering with the scientific process. So I do make a distinction, a separation between science and religion there. But where we go from there, I think that's where religion comes in. I mean, like for example, a physicist like Stephen Hawking uh, says that there is no creator to the world. Yeah. So when he makes that sort of statement, to me, he's going beyond his capacity as a scientist, because that's a sort of a metaphysical statement. So it's the metaphysicians to debate on that issue, whether science actually, whether the physical world has a creator or not. And this is precisely the point that Al-Ghazali was saying, that one should distinguish between metaphysics and physics. So one can be a great physicist, yeah, like Stephen Hawking, but can deny the existence of a creator of the world. And to me, where our Islamic belief comes in is when such contested view, contentious view, like Hawking about the absence of creator, that's where I can sort of put down my Muslim foot down. Yeah. But as far as his physics is concerned, then I would leave it as it is. Yeah. Okay.
I think this question from Brother Fakra, Sister Fakra is too long. I will report to you later on. We take from Brother Nuruddin. Prof, can you explain how the position of science, natural sciences, in the Islamization of knowledge project? There are some critics who claim that the Islamization of knowledge only targets social science, but ignores the Islamization of natural science. Please respond.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is quite true, partly because of the differences in the nature of the natural sciences as compared to the social sciences. Yeah? Because as Kuhn has fairly pointed out, in the natural sciences, like for example in physics, you only have one dominant paradigm existing at any period of time. Yeah? Perhaps with a few exceptions, like for example in physics, you have sometimes two theories which are not completely incompatible, but so the dominance of a paradigm implies that it is a monoparadigmatic state in the natural sciences. But in the social sciences, it is quite legitimate to have more than one paradigm. Yeah? And they could not only be merely symbolic paradigms, but also operational paradigms. Yeah? For example, what I mean, let me give an example. You can have, for example, a classical economics or neoclassical economics, which is closely allied to capitalism. Or you could have socialist economics, and actually practiced by certain countries such as the former Soviet Union and China in the past. They could actually have different theoretical constructions of economics and actually put them into practice, operationalize them. You could have a country like Russia in the past, based on system of central planning, based on socialist economics. Yeah? And incidentally, this also gives a chance for Muslims to articulate their own form of economics, which is Islamic economics. And Muslim scholars have developed their own series of Islamic economics, which is based on different assumptions. Assumptions like the absence of riba, yeah? because in classical Western economics, you have what is known as interest rates, yeah, and how interest rates is accepted and how it functions within the economic system. But if you have an Islamic system which rejects interest rates, which is as riba, then your whole theory of economics would be based on a different premise. Yeah? But that is possible to do. It's possible. Yeah? You may just have a different set of functions, different set of axioms in constructing your economic system, yeah, based on non acceptance of interest rates. Yeah? So it's possible to develop a different theoretical system based on different assumptions, just like how it is possible to have, you know, different geometrical systems, Euclidean and non-Euclidean, based on different assumptions. So that's possible in the social sciences, and it actually happens in the social sciences. But in the natural sciences, it's difficult to Islamize physics as you can Islamize economics, for example, because the nature of physics or science or the scientific community is such that they only have one paradigm, and practitioners, the scientific community, practice on, yeah. So you cannot, for example, different physical theory based on different assumptions, simply to accommodate your religious beliefs, because the criteria there is experimental proof. Yeah. So there's no point articulating a different metaphysical system if it cannot be verified experimentally, and that's the difficulty in trying to create an alternative theoretical system in the natural science. So if you want to have a program of Islamization of science, of natural sciences, then it has to be at the philosophical level. It has to be at the epistemological level. Yeah? As I've illustrated earlier, you have the object level and the meta level, and it's only at the meta level that you can have a different conception of things, of science. Yeah? So the Islamization can be carried out, but with the understanding the meta level project, not an object level project. Okay.
Thank you so much, Prof. Since our time is up, we invite you for 1 or 2 minute concluding remark, Prof, for today.
Well, as I've suggested in my talk, this is not an easy task. I must admit that it is not an easy task, but it is a task which Muslims must take upon themselves if they're going to claim their own scientific legacy, and they are going to claim their own narrative and chart their own path for their own future. A future which is not necessarily gloomy, which is not necessarily bogged down by all sorts of baggages, historical, metaphysical, and so on, but to take an optimistic view of the future by taking into account all these things that needs to be discussed and addressed as a foundation for the future development of the Muslim Ummah, which I am hopeful for. Okay.
Thank you, Prof. We are so blessed to have you and other profound scholars who are devoting their life, their passion for the Muslim Ummah. We pray for your good health, inshallah. We see you next week, the same time, same day, inshallah. Thank you, everyone. We'll start again tomorrow with our second week of class. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Welcome, salam, and thank you for listening. I just hope that the audio quality can be improved in future.
It is better at the end when you speak closer to the laptop.
Okay.
Next week will be much better, inshallah. Okay then, Assalamualaikum.